Today we're going to go through some steps successfully in your business. So we're going to start kind of from a new user or new company perspective and walk through some expectations and help provide guidelines for things that can help make this whole process smoother. So in today's webinar, we're going to go through looking at internal project management and how having an internal project manager can help keep the project on track. Starting right, identifying when you should in your business cycle implement Plant 3D and kind of highlighting some positives to different starting points. We're going to look at a training schedule and highlight the value in different orders of training. We're going to look at a pilot project, and if you're going to do a pilot project, what types of information should you include when you do a pilot project, and how do you execute that? Also going to look at getting hands-on with the product. What do you, as you're doing your pilot project, what things should you capture in order to help make sure that you can implement this or roll it out on a full company-wide basis? And last of all, some technical aspects, making sure that you understand tagging and its place and priority within Plant 3D, and then also line numbering and how that will affect your project configuration and project setup. So let's take a deeper dive into internal project management. So I think everyone's familiar with project management, the process. Obviously, a project manager helps keep a project on track by identifying risks, issues, stages and phases, and also making sure that people are kept up in contact with the project and keeping the task execution on schedule. So one of the advantages that we have, if you do have a large enough implementation, to have a dedicated project manager internally, is that it signifies accountability and commitment from the company itself. So obviously having another resource in there to manage the project, to check up on your internal groups, means that the company is invested in the success of this project and also making sure that it's going to happen and get executed within a reasonably short timeline. The next thing that having an internal project manager do for your project will be to take major issues that either between departments or product issues, but also take those to management so that they can get resolved and not just linger or stay in someone's to-do list and never get resolved. So having a project manager take those, they usually have a more consistent platform with upper management. It can help get some of those issues resolved quickly. The next thing that a project manager will do will integrate and talk to internal teams so that the groups can identify who has a task in their court that they are responsible to take care of, and also hand off and make sure that that task, if it needs to be collaborated on between several groups, that collaboration process happens and doesn't just linger in one area or another. So it's very powerful as far as just keeping the internal teams motivated to keep on board and keep on track as they take care of different items in the project. And then one of the bigger things that the project manager can do is he can identify internal risks. So sometimes it's there's a lot of schedules. You have existing projects and work that is going on. You have people taking vacation time. You have people scheduling field trips to go out and do measurements on a different project. So a project manager is going to know all of these different aspects and has access to resources to find out all these aspects. And so they will be in a much better position to identify where schedule might be impacted by different other projects, might be impacted by other personnel, or also might be maybe there's a different conflict with other groups, or maybe there's multiple teams responsible for other implementations of other products in the company, like maybe a customer system, management system, or some sort of infrastructure type of system, like a new IT upgrade or email or exchange. So project managers are going to be in the loop and be able to identify those items and also see how they would impact the schedule. So at this stage, it's really, obviously if it's a small implementation, it's not as big of a deal. If it's 1 or 2 users, this would be kind of overkill. But if you have several teams and several groups that are going to look at implementing Plant 3D, then you're going to want to make sure that they can have a platform to bring issues and tasks and stay on schedule and on budget with the work for implementing the product. And a project manager can really contribute to that process. So there is this magical spot when we talk about how do we start, when do we start our plan implementation? There's a magical spot between when everyone has downtime and everyone's overbooked. And obviously that's kind of a, you can't really predict when that's going to happen in all cases. So it's sort of like a fairy tale where, the bed's too hard, too soft, Goldilocks type thing. So you want to make sure it's just right. But what are some things that we want to identify as what would cause issues with implementing it during a downtime? What's going to cause issues if you try to implement when you're overbooked? So let's first of all start by taking a look at downtime. So obviously the advantage is in downtime you have a high availability of resources, but there's low risk, but there's also some other downsides. So one of the downsides might be you have low motivation. So there's not like a project schedule coming up that's going to motivate people to stay on task and get this stuff done. So in some cases, it can be a downside to implement during downtime. Also, there's also the budget consideration. Sometimes during a downtime, companies are less willing to spend money. But if these other issues like availability are a big consideration, then obviously that's going to trump the amount of money because you want to be able to get people to learn when you can get them to. So you just want to spend some time thinking about what are some potential things that might affect you for your timing of your integration or implementation. So what's going to happen if you try to implement when you're overbooked? So sometimes you have low availability. Obviously, it's the opposite of downtime. So everyone's busy. That when you're trying to do this when everyone's booked, small issues, maybe it's a connection to a server, maybe it's an item missing from a catalog. Even though it's something that can be resolved reasonably quickly, if it's a learning item, it might take someone a little bit longer to pick it up. All of those can push project schedules back. And so obviously you want to be able to identify when those occur so you can get those smoothed out as quickly as possible. And then in addition to the kind of corresponding to the availability, you're competing for resources. So from other groups and other departments, you might be competing for IT resources if they need to configure things. You might be competing for administrative resources on the CAD side, having to set maybe your CAD administrators configuring standards for a client, and you need them to be working on maybe pipe spec content. So you do want to kind of try to gauge when is a good medium level of busyness to highlight doing your Plant 3D implementation. Obviously, if it's going to, in a lot of cases, if you're coming from 2D or other software packages, the cost savings can be enough that it doesn't matter when you do it. But you still want to be aware of the issues that you might run into and kind of understand what you're getting into before you actually get into it. So training schedules, this is something that I've done a lot of thinking about it, but I've also, we've tested different things with different clients over the years to try and figure out what is the best training scenario. So one of the most frequently requested items is a lot of times people want to have their own training data set done on their own standards, and because that's the fastest way to get up to speed. Now, in some cases, that's true. The difficulty with that is, if we're provided a data set, we can't always guarantee that that data set is going to cover all of the aspects of the software. So you end up getting a lesser quality training experience because you don't have documentation for how to step through it. The users might be confused based on the instructions having to change. And then there's some, things like that can kind of throw a wrench in the gears. So one of our recommendations is to start with a fundamental training. We use Ascent software. And so the fundamentals for plant design is the latest version that we use for, I think we're on 2019 now. But we start with the book for that, and it comes with the data sets so that we know that all the exercises are going to work. We also know that the book is going to cover virtually every workflow that the software has capabilities for. So rather than just targeting just one way to do things, it's going to give you a lot of options and help you see the breadth of the product that you wouldn't get if you're focused on one tiny part of the product in one data set. So we know that it has wide coverage on the product. We know that the users, when they come in and sit down, they're going to have step-by-step instructions with where to click and when to click. And so it's optimized to take the hurdle of having to understand what to do next and listing it out so that they can focus on learning how the program functions rather than trying to figure out and learn how it's going to be integrated. So sometimes trying to figure out how it's working with their stuff and see it working with their stuff, it ends up being a troubleshooting session if you do that live in the fundamental training, and they said they would miss out on really actually just focusing on the software part of this. So the next step, in my opinion, is to start with the pilot project. So after they've had the fundamentals training, they get fairly comfortable with the software after that, and they can draw some drawings and get some stuff inside the product. But I like to follow that up, and we like to follow that up with a pilot project shortly after they take the fundamental training course. So this gives them the opportunity to review the classes they've had, kind of go back over their notes, review the things they've learned in the workflows and the workshop, and it gets them kind of processing the product all over again, which it helps their memory and their retention for how much of the learning they retain. It also helps them kind of start to see how it's going to impact their daily work process. So when you're using other products, every product can do 10 different things, 10 different ways. And so by getting to work on a pilot project gives them the experience of doing their daily work, but using this product and using this workflow. And so the pilot project comes in handy. And so one of the things we'll get into a little bit later is that there are some things that we'll capture out of this pilot project because we want to make sure we get the feedback and address it in a constructive way so that they're not burning time trying to figure out how to do things, so that there's a productive list of things to do and workflows that they need to be learned coming out of the pilot project. Next in the list is we go through admin training. And so in the admin training, what we tend to do is we tend to create a custom project template for you and your scenario. And so the benefit for that is you get to see us make that on the fly. We'll teach you about creating properties and what types of properties there are, teach you about how to create isometric styles. There's some things we can do on the back end of ISO style to speed up isometric configuration. There's some timing things that can happen. We'll teach you about creating catalog and spec content. And so all these things are part of it at our administrator course. The reason that I tend to prefer to schedule this afterwards is I found that when we have users go through the fundamentals and when they've had their time doing a pilot project, they come to the administrative course ready to ask questions. They have a list of things that they want to do. They just haven't been able to figure it out yet. And so A, they're more motivated. B, when we start explaining how the software works, you tend to see light bulbs go on instead of just saying sort of nods of assent of, yes, that makes sense. So it helps them connect the dots better when they've already had this foundation of going through the fundamentals course, going through the pilot project, and then finally kind of coming to and seeing how this all pulls together from the admin point of view. So that's our preference. It's definitely, I think, the projects we've seen, obviously depends on the client and the users that are in the classes, but we've seen a lot more success following a plan like this than trying to start off with the administrative course and then going back and getting fundamentals after the fact. So this is our preferred training schedule. And then I also like to include, as this process goes, at no point in time do we want users to just be sitting, burning hours trying to figure out how to do things. And so our recommendation is, in conjunction with these things, have some sort of mentoring agreement with us so that, maybe every week for the first 4 weeks, we spend an hour kind of just reviewing your question list. And almost never when we take calls or do a session like that do we have one question that gets answered. Most of the time they might call us about one question, and then while we're on the phone they think about 4 or 5 more, and we go ahead and work through those. And so having a mentoring agreement with us will let us kind of have the flexibility to do that as you need it and as your people have availability. Then we can just jump in and make sure that people aren't burning their wheels. I'm fine. I like people using the forums. I'm on the forums a lot. So if people are Googling the forums and trying to find things, that's great. But bottom line, if you're spending more than an hour or 2 hours trying to find a solution to something, then you're probably already losing money on it. And generally we can answer a lot of the questions in 15 minutes or less. So it kind of just depends on how much of the struggle do you want to take hold of. So we really prefer to have a mentoring session in conjunction with these training plans. Let's move on. And that transition was for my daughter, Allison, who loves the glitter. So pilot projects. So let's go a little bit deeper into pilot project and kind of run through what that's going to look like. So we start off by identifying the users that need to be in this pilot project. And believe it or not, it's not going to be just the CAD users, because Plant 3D integrates into a system. And so each of these people will interact with the product in different ways. So for example, a checker is going to be reviewing the isometrics that get put out. And so he's going to have a lot of input into what should change on the drawing, what's not clear, what they prefer to see a different way, implementing, the standards that your fab shop might be using. The checker is going to have that input, and his feedback is going to control what ends up going into the kind of the administrative options later on down the road. Your project manager might integrate and need to know certain reports out of the report creator to identify material lists or things like that. And so he might be interfacing and using the report creator to generate those reports, or might have to talk to someone who can do that. And he maybe just picks up the Excel spreadsheet, but he still needs to know where to find it. He might need to know how to browse your network to locate it in Windows Explorer. An engineer might use a report that's exported from the report creator to fill in more data. And so like he might type in specs about the valve or design pressures and temperatures in the line list. And so he would need to know the process for finding the Excel file that he needs to edit, understand that he needs to communicate when he's finished with it or needs to update the change, and if he has access to the software, how to use the data manager to bring in the change and verify that the right properties have been modified. So each of these should at least have one representative from these types of groups as a pilot participant, just so they can experience the workflow, and you get feedback also as you do this about things that they like or things that they don't like, or workflows that they would like to see affect their group. As far as the pilot plan goes, my recommendation is to just start with 3 PNIDs. Obviously, it depends if you're implementing the PNID portion or just the 3D side, but you want a small set of PNIDs that can be pretty easily modeled quickly. You're going to want to have a civil grade in. You're going to want to have some structural steel in, and these can come from existing projects. So there's no need to create them from brand new. You can just pull stuff out of existing projects. But you do want to limit the content and try to put as much stuff as you already have designed from the other disciplines in place so that they're just focusing on learning the product. You're going to want to use 4 to 6 equipment data sheets. And so you might create some of the equipment in Inventor. You might create some of it in Plant 3D and test different processes for importing and linking the equipment. But you do want to have enough so that you can model it and route some piping and have that all connected. And you're going to also want to pull in piping isometrics that use that equipment. So you definitely want these to coordinate. So the PNIDs and the equipment and piping should all be about the same area of the plant or facility that you're working on. And then the isometrics, having that many would give 2 to 3 pipers, maybe like 4 to 8 hours of time to work on this. And if they can knock it out, kind of just depends on how quickly they pick up the product. But if they can knock that out, that'll give them experience routing. They can just follow the isometric and look at the points in space and see where things are supposed to be placed and kind of have a route defined for them, so they're not doing actual design work and trying to strategize how to route the pipe. They're just following the dimension information placed and kind of getting a feel for the product. So it also helps them, again, get familiar with the product and using it and how that's going to work. You will need pipe specs. Again, I recommend carbon steel and stainless steel just because those are pretty standard. And you'll kind of see what you get and what the spec experience is going to look like as you route pipe. And then you're going to want to identify which products you're going to implement. So if they're going to use Plant 3D only to do all this, if they're going to use Inventor, if you're going to do a review session in Navisworks. So typically when I'm training people on how to do this, we start routing off the PNID, then we route the pipe. We might look in Navisworks to see and try to find our route that we're going to use. Then we run an ISO of that to make sure we got everything, compare the ISO to the PNID, make sure we put all the things, the valves in the line. And then I'll do a final review in the model to make sure I'm not doing any clashes. And so once that's done, then I consider the line route and I mark it off on my P&ID. But that's just some kind of workflow things that people can get used to, kind of depends on your design process. And so as you're doing this pilot project, as they're modeling, and before you ever start the modeling, really, you want to kind of decide on what they're going to look for, because a pilot project needs to have deliverables. You need to have a point to it, and you need to have things that you want to capture out of it. It's not just for them to get time on the software. You want to capture more than that. So they need to have a way to identify the issues and store them. So typically it's going to be an Excel spreadsheet. So everyone should be able to just type in the description, kind of type in what they're doing, what drawing was affected if they're modeling something and they ran into an issue. Then you want to also rank those and prioritize those and say, okay, this is a big deal that we didn't know how to do this, or this is a big deal that when you try to model it this way, something didn't work right. Maybe you're bringing a workflow from a different product and trying to do it in Plant 3D. You need to identify those and prioritize the ones that are showstoppers, the ones that are not a big deal, and the ones that are training items. And then that list is something that, as you know, if we had talks or mentoring sessions, we'd go through and we'd work to resolve those. And then depending on the severity and the resolution, if it's just a quick little thing, then we might not document it. But if it's going to be a major workflow that affects multiple groups, we're going to want to document the resolutions to those issues as they occur, so that you have training material in the future and guidelines for the next projects. So want to make sure everyone's on board about the things that they need to capture, how they're going to document those things, how they're going to track them as they come up, so that when we execute the pilot, they can go through, they can create the P&IDs if that's what they're doing. They can create the model and the isometrics and the orthos and kind of just walk through that process, making sure that they go back through and as they run into things, fill in the spreadsheet, definitely keep track of all those items, because then that makes the mentoring sessions much more valuable and much more productive. And then at the end, I took a PMI course a while back, and one of the favorite things I picked up from it was the idea of the lessons learned. And I think we definitely don't do this enough. But at the end of the project, sitting down, having some time to really do a rigorous review of lessons learned, not just say, oh, I think it went well, or, oh, we should do this, but actually let's go through. And since we have a structured way to get feedback and issue tracking, that gives us something that tangible that we can sift through and review and categorize the issues that came up. We can take a look at the workflows that people did, have them make notes, you know, as they go through the projects, make notes about different workflow and how this product works from other ones differently. You want to have them sit down and say, what is better about this? What is worse? You know, what things are we going to have to change also to work with Plant 3D versus things that were working a different way. And then also out of this lessons learned, you want to identify training topics or things that you want to do but didn't necessarily have time to figure out or nail down during the course of the pilot. So kind of along the lines of enabling the pilot project and again, just hitting the bullet points of what are we going to be doing during the pilot project, we really need to make sure that the users are getting hands-on time. And so in some of the implementations that have frankly gone the worst, it's pretty obvious why they went badly. I did a training class for one client. This was a long time ago. I did a training class in, I don't remember the month, but let's just say it was like in May. They didn't get the software installed until the following April. So it was 11 months afterwards. And at that point, no one knew how to use it. So I flew back and trained all the same people on all the same stuff exactly 1 year later. So you do want to make sure people have the software installed. You want to make sure that they have a reason to use it. So that's kind of going back to the point of when do we start this process? If they have different project types that don't require any 3D piping design for the next 6 months, they're going to forget what they learned, right? It's just human. None of us can remember things for that long. So you want to get them the software access early. You want to make sure that you can commit to them spending time on the software after training. So maybe it's 3 to 4 hours. Maybe they're going to jump on a project right after this and they have to, get the work done and it's a crash course. But they need to have hands-on time with the product right after training so that they can take advantage of all the things that they've learned. Like we mentioned in the previous slide, tracking issues is a big deal, and it really helps, to know that they have resources and a way to resolve these things and the issues that come up. It helps the communication process, because if one person's having a problem, most of the time it's something that several people will run into. And especially if you start with the power users, they're going to be running into things. They're going to be familiar with the other users in their group and how they're used to working. And having those documented and identified is going to help the whole team keep moving in a progressive way. The weekly check-ins, again, it might be 1 hour, maybe take an hour a week and review the list with us or internally, just to make sure that nothing is outstanding. And then also a list of workflows. So if we keep a list of the workflows that are changing, then when new people come in, or if there's a lapse in product usage or something like that, then we already have documentation and stuff in place for them to pick back up the software or to start learning it from scratch and say, okay, here's how we're going to create catalogs, or here's where our specs are stored. Having that information documented helps the transition between users and between projects and administrative personnel so much easier, because they can just go read through it, kind of get an idea. As long as they have an idea what the product's doing, then they can just see, okay, that's where you're storing stuff, and they can get back to being useful and up to speed on everything right. Technical issues. So tagging, one of the biggest things you want to nail down about your project before you start it and before you start doing things and putting information in is your tag format. So typically when you're working with a client, they will give you a lead sheet or a symbol sheet with their symbols that they're going to use. A lot of times they also have indicated what their equipment tags are going to look like. Common ones are you have the type of equipment and then a number. You might have an area, a type, and a number. So there's a variety of them, but you want to make sure you get those set up at the very beginning. And the reason I say that is if we go through and let's say we put in a type and a number, and then we discover, well, they really want area, then we have to go back to every single piece of item of equipment that we've tagged, and we have to assign the tag again. Now, it's like a 2-second process, but it's still a 2-second process on everything that they put on a P&ID or in a model. There are tools, there has been some code put out that automate some of this, but even in those scenarios, it's been hit or miss in some situations because it's not fully supported. So there's still cases where even if you do find the plugin that automates some of the retagging, you end up manually updating some of the tag. So it's really just in the best interest to nail down your tag formats up front so that the people entering the data just have to do it one time and you're not going to miss a project deadline by having to go back and retag everything the day that the drawings have to go out. Another thing that you kind of want to keep in mind is that your tag formats for your P&IDs and your 3D models are going to be different. So I could have one tag format for my equipment and my blowers, and then a different one on the 3D model side. The general idea is that you want to make them match as much as possible so that obviously if they're mapped and things are inserted, then they have the same properties. If they're going through reports and you ended up having a report on your 3D model side and a report on your P&ID, they're going to match and look the same. And then this is going to be even more important when we get to the next slide about the pipeline groups. I do want to make a couple notes. The one active tag format per class. So for facilities that have been around for a long time, most of the time they've gone through 3 or 4 tag format changes where maybe they started with an area and then they ended up adding some other designation about a facility number or something like that. So what would happen is that in Plant 3D, you can only have one active tag format. So if I set equipment tag with the type and the number current, everything I tag from that point on is going to have the type and the number format. Now, if I wanted to change that one and set the area type and number current, I can do that. But from that point on, everything that I tag is going to be in the area type and number format. So you could feasibly, tag all the old stuff one way, switch your tag format to a newer way, and then tag it and have those all updated. But just keep in mind that if you went to retag something like an old thing, if you hit the assign tag dialog box and you hit OK, it would update with whatever is current. And so you might lose an old tag and have to go back and fix that. Also, you're not going to get any conflict checks. So like, for example, it's not going to check if the tag format's not current. It's not going to check the area property to make sure that it's in the tag. It's just going to check the string that's there. So there are some things you can do and some workarounds, but in general, the rule of thumb is one active tag format per class. These are inheritable. So in this example that's showing on the PowerPoint, the equipment tag format is defined on the equipment class, but it's available for the blower class. And you can see where it says number 1, the tag format selection is selectable there. And so I could select a different one, or I can create a new one just for blowers if I would like to do that. And that's everything for this slide. So let's switch on to line numbers, and this will be the 7th and almost most critical item for this. Line numbering. So the most important thing to grasp, and this is one of the things we teach in our admin course, but is the difference between groups and segments or components. So I have a little diagram here on the P&ID that shows 3 different segments. They're numbered 1, 2, and 3. The first segment runs from TK001 to the reducer, 4x3 reducer. The second segment runs from the reducer to P01, 001. The third segment is the drain from the 4-inch line down to the cap or plug. That's bad graphics. Anyways, so the point is that in that scenario, every one of us who pipe this up would say that is line 1001, right? But there's actually 4 different line numbers depending on how you define line number. So some people might see there's a 1-inch CS150 NH1001, there's a 3-inch CS150 NH1001, and there's a 4-inch CS150 NH1001. The key thing is all those are grouped by a single common property, and that's the tag. And in this case, and in most cases, people use the number value as the tag. And so what that does is that means that anywhere that we have 1001, it means it's referring to a single run of pipe that starts at this tank and ends at this pump, and it might have a drain on it, and has a drain on it. So that's going to exist only one time in one spot. If we have 1002, that's a completely separate line. Likewise, in the way this tag format is set up, there's no service. So a lot of companies, the second most popular way to tag line groups is to have the service included. So for some companies, they could have NH1001. They could also have AG1001. And the combination of the service and the line number is what guarantees a unique value. And so this depends on your client standards, obviously, and your internal standards if you are the client. But those are the 2 ways that you would govern and the properties that you would use to govern your line group tag. Now, when people use the software, one of the most common issues and mistakes we see made is that the P3 line group class over here at the top right, most of the time they'll add in the size, the spec, the installation and heat tracing that they want to see on the drawing file. And so that's the reason that is inappropriate, is that's a lot more properties that it's going to check and compare against for consistency. And so, for example, we could have 4-inch CS150 NH1001. The program would also let us put in 3-inch CS150 NH1001. Well, those are really duplicate values because we want only one line number 1001. And so you want to make sure that if you don't catch anything else, catch this pipeline group and the P3 line group. The tag formats have to match, and they should not include sizing information. Generally, they shouldn't include spec information either. So most of the time, 99% of the time, you're going to do the line number value only, the service and line number value, and in some rare cases, the area, service, and a line number. Well, the next question comes up, well, then how do I get my line number to show up right in the model or on the orthographic drawing or isometric? Well, in the model, you're just going to use the line number to route by. So you're not going to enter in the size information. You're just going to pick your number 1001. The data manager will be used to add the values for your nominal size, nominal spec, and other service information. On the orthographic drawings, you'll use annotations to place the values that you want to see in addition to the line number value. And then the isometrics, they have their own way of creating annotations and adding in your value using complex line numbers, as I like to call them, to display that value. So there's other ways to get the data and the full line number tag on the drawing, but using it in the pipeline group tag format is not the place to do that. So we had two technical steps and kind of 5 scheduling and project management steps. I just wanted to throw those out there and kind of give you guys some perspective on that. Hopefully you found it valuable and worth your time, and I appreciate you listening to us and joining ASTI for this webinar.